Art. Is it truthful? Who has the right to say if it is or isn't? The artist? The historian? All of us? Does the truth lie in what art shows us, or what it doesn't show us? By blurring the line between the familiar and the uncanny, surrealist art can make us question how we see the world. But what does it say about what we consider normal?
It was about doing whatever you want and not having to explain it.
I would say by unsettling reality, there's a lot to be revealed, and that's one of the ways to do it in the surrealist tradition of things.
I think I like people to be a bit more mindful about their surroundings and kind of look at the world around them with fresher eyes, like a kid would do.
Surrealism grew out of the disillusionment and uncertainty that followed in the wake of the First World War. It was a follow-on from Dada, an art movement that rejected traditional values completely. But why did this art form develop? And why are artists still creating surrealist works today?
They were critiquing the world around them, so traditional ways of seeing, traditional ways of being, traditional ways of acting or interacting with the world. They wanted to show that that wasn't the limit, and that's what they were rebelling against, the sort of stagnant world and stagnant art.
Yeah, I think that's why surrealism has been so popular with such an enduring legacy, more so than any of the other art history movements, because it uses a visual language that everybody understands regardless of whether or not you're trained in art or art history.
When people look at my work and notice that I've used everyday objects, things that they could use and do the same, I feel like I want to make them be a bit more inspired about their surroundings. When you're a kid, you look at the world with like very fresh eyes, and you don't know what a spoon is meant for, or a chair is meant for.
That's what surrealism is known for, is creating new worlds, and I think maybe that's also partly why it has been so popular. I think there's an element of childlike wonder in the way that it takes very different things and puts them together.
So it's about this sort of surreal potential of everyday objects. So you've got this beautiful old chair that's all of a sudden grown a tail. And it looks like it could just sort of leap off the floor and run away. But it still very much retains its chair-like features as much as it retains its cat-like features. So it's this idea of putting two things together, and something very ordinary with something sort of slightly extraordinary, and giving you this new way of looking at the world.
The fact that the chair is not alive, it doesn't move, it can't speak, it can't actually cuddle you, but when you give it a tail and give it that furry fabric, all of a sudden you start thinking about it in a slightly different way.
Usually in my work, I tend to use everyday objects. I think one of the reasons for that, we usually just take them for granted and they've got a specific purpose. It doesn't necessarily matter if it's like a piece of furniture or if it's a plant or food, and looking for a way to kind of change their meaning. So it's not food that you eat anymore, it becomes my legs or my head. Like I've got this image where I've got a pomelo instead of my head, or 2 bits of aloe vera instead of my legs.
It's interesting to sort of see yourself mirrored almost in those objects and to project a sense of humanity onto them. When you hold an image in your head, you also hold an expectation of what it should bring to you, of what it's like to touch it, to smell it, to be near it. And then if you have 2 images that you wouldn't put together like that, it can generate a lot of meaning and a lot of thought in unexpected ways.
Surrealists also use language and symbols in playful and evocative ways, swapping images with words to unsettle the senses and play with the psyche.
I think surrealism gives you sort of new visual signs and symbols to express things that you might not otherwise be able to express. Magritte was really interested in creating images that are very realistic, and he approached painting in quite a traditional way. He liked the idea of juxtaposing images with words, so it's this idea of sort of depiction versus description versus reality. So what you see with the magic mirror is a mirror, and you're looking into it, and in the real world you'd expect to see a human reflection, but in Magritte's world it just says human body. And it's that same idea of contrasting signs and signals and images, using that to make the viewer feel uncomfortable or slightly sort of disconnected from the world. Feels almost like a psychological tactic.
One of the things that I use in my work is the use of like animal heads or masks, like different faces. Because I am a woman of colour, when I use myself in my work, it kind of roots me in a very particular position. But then if I cover my face with something else, it kind of expands the ability for me to represent other areas.
Within Surrealism, artists such as Francesca Woodman and Claude Cahun have reimagined identity and the body, challenging fixed ideas of gender and reclaiming representation on their own terms. Their work still resonates with artists who are continuing to question how we see ourselves.
In more feminist approaches to art, you see doubling and mirroring as a sort of way of exploring the psyche, exploring different sides of yourself. So I think for Cahun, the mirroring was part of that, sort of exploring gender identity, using masks, using mirrors, and using doubling to sort of look at different sides of themselves. Francesca Woodman sort of uses her own body, so she was sort of challenging gender norms, preconceived ideas of the way that a woman should move in a space, and she's turning that on its head by presenting the viewer with something that's sort of uncanny and strange.
I would say my work explores patriarchal expectations by collaging together various different imagery of women and what you project onto them, but then subverting that in quite a grotesque way a lot of the time. When you do that, you start to question why such expectations exist in the first place. For example, why is it so hot and sexy and funny to have 2 boobs, but 3 is not hot anymore? Why do you want to see me stripped down naked, but then when I start to actually take my skin off, that's too far. We don't like that.
Even though sometimes my photos might look a bit grotesque or unsettling, my intention is not really that. I think I find them quite funny and also the process when I make them is quite playful and improvised. And I guess some of the parallels that I was trying to draw was to do with like women's role in the house and like how there are these preconceptions of women having to know their place. Because stai în banca ta literally translates, it's the Romanian for stay at your desk, which means to behave or know your place. And we're not really allowed to kind of like have something to say, and you need to know your place is in the kitchen, whatever, doing the domestic things. And I wanted to challenge that and like get the women kind of like break free, like the furniture would break free.
Breaking free from expectations, from identity, and from the roles imposed on us has long been at the heart of artistic expression. For many, Surrealism became a way to challenge those constraints. Decades on, it still resonates with audiences around the world, not just as a style, but as a response to uncertainty.
I think Surrealism matters today because a lot of that art was created at a time of great social and political upheaval. I think it all goes back to the escapism of it, wanting to leave the old world behind and looking for something new. There's something optimistic about that, even if there's a lot of anxiety in it too.
Through my work, I'm not trying to kind of say necessarily something very specific. I really like people being the ones that pose the questions rather than me posing questions. And that happens quite often because people see different things in my work and they relate to it in different ways.
Understanding that the truth lies a lot of the time in the way that we perceive things, and there's multiple different ways of perceiving things. You can have one event that would occur or one object and everyone would have a very different way of understanding it. But
also just see something of yourself in a surrealist painting because they're so beyond the logical. I just hope that people resonate with the creativity of it, that everything doesn't have to be boring all the time. We can be a little bit radical.